Welcome to Close Listening. I'm Zach Morgenstern, joined as always by silent co-host Ludwig Bombay. I'm holding this Bob Dylan print in my hands. I don't know if it's by a particular artist. It's tied to a company called Civil Disobedience, but I don't know. I don't have a CD to hold, so I figure I'm just holding this. I just got through a process where I listened to every single Bob Dylan studio album, not including the bootleg series. That would be another challenge for another day that I don't think I'm going to take on. But the last time I did challenges like this, I reviewed every single Beatles album I listened to, but didn't review every single Rolling Stones album. I made a video where I summed up the experience and ranked all the albums. Since then, I've, gained more experience doing these YouTube music reviews and thought maybe a better, more interesting way to do it would not be to jump straight into ranking the albums, though I will do that, but just rather find a way to talk about the experience of listening to every Bob Dylan album, how I would sum it up if I were to give a lecture on the topic. But I decided to break Bob Dylan's career down into different musical periods, some of which are probably very predictable, some of which may be slightly less so. And then after describing each period and the general feeling I had about listening to the music from it, I'm going to list 5 songs that I view as defining that period. And in picking those 5 songs, I had to do a tough balancing act between choosing songs that are basically iconic, but maybe not always picking the 5 most famous songs, if maybe slipping another in there does a better job of summing up the whole period. So Bob Dylan's first career period is what I call the Guthrie period. This includes the albums Bob Dylan, The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, The Times They Are A-Changing, and Another Side of Bob Dylan. I call this the Guthrie period because this is when he's largely just doing acoustic guitar and harmonica on his record. He's someone who's been inspired by Woody Guthrie. And even though Bob Dylan would later claim he was not a very political singer, he didn't like the idea of being a protest singer, he considered it to be too much pressure. Insofar as he was political, it was because Woody Guthrie, who was an outright leftist, even communist, sometimes agitprop singer, Bob Dylan ended up emulating some of that, even if the politics ultimately weren't quite the good fit. As my 5 iconic songs of this era, I picked Blowin' in the Wind, Don't Think Twice, It's All Right, A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll, and It Ain't Me, Babe. I'm sure there are a lot of songs people could object to being left out from this period, but basically Blowin' in the Wind, Don't Think Twice, It's All Right, and A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall are some of the most iconic songs of all time. Blowing in the Wind is one of the best encapsulations of a catch-all protest song. A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall is where Bob Dylan took the folk tradition and made it his own. And Don't Think Twice, It's All Right is kind of unique as a Bob Dylan song, and even though it's widely covered, I feel like it's not an enjoyable song to listen to unless you hear it in the sincerity of Bob's original voice, because it has such a unique stream of conscious feel. I picked The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll over The Times They Are A-Changing because The Times They Are A-Changing, also a great song, but doesn't add anything to the picture that Blowing in the Wind didn't already do, whereas The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll showed Bob Dylan's commitment in this period to being more like Woody Guthrie and actually recording protest songs with some specificity. And finally, while I don't actually love the final album, Another Side of Bob Dylan, a lot of songs on there were made good when other artists covered them, gave them a fuller sound. And on top of that, It Ain't Me, Babe is such an important part of the Bob Dylan story because even though it sounds on its surface like a love song, it's really about him saying, I can't be this Woody Guthrie impersonator much longer. The next period is what I call the peak period, as in these are the songs that are most considered masterpieces and defining of Bob Dylan if someone was to do an impersonation of him. So the peak period includes the albums Bringing It All Back Home, Highway 61 Revisited, Blonde on Blonde, The Basement Tapes, which were technically released years later but were recorded in this period, and John Wesley Harding. And for my defining songs of this period, I picked Subterranean Homesick Blues, Mr. Tambourine Man, Like a Rolling Stone, Just Like a Woman, and All Along the Watchtower. Mr. Tambourine Man maybe doesn't quite fit in with this period, but it doesn't fit in with the Guthrie period too. It's an acoustic song and certainly one that old folkies could like, but it was Dylan searching out the beautiful and quasi-spiritual rather than writing something that Woody Guthrie would necessarily write. Subterranean Homesick Blues is the song that announced the arrival of his hard electric sound, and its music video lends itself wonderfully to the caricature of Bob Dylan music. Like a Rolling Stone has an infectious organ riff. It's one of Dylan's most famous songs of all time. And while it sort of continues to be a protest song in that it's a song about the arrogance of the rich, it's also kind of this era in that it's filled with sort of poetic devices, and it's more about storytelling than it is about politics. Just Like a Woman, I'm putting here just more because it's such a significant song in the Dylan catalog. It certainly has its lyrical style, but it's one of the few where he tried to write a genuinely beautiful melody. And finally, I had to put All Along the Watchtower here because just like Mr. Tambourine Man, it's a very interesting Dylan song in its own right, and it's also one that inspired a great cover. I call the next period the Romantic period. This includes Nashville Skyline, Self Portrait, New Morning, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, Dylan, Planet Waves, Blood on the Tracks, and Desire. So, romantic is a word that can mean lots of things. Obviously, it means love and romance, and there's certainly more focus on confessional love song writing, particularly on Blood on the Tracks, in this period than there was in his Guthrie period or even in his peak period. I also call it the romantic period because it feels more from the heart. I felt with the peak period, Dylan sometimes felt compelled to write impressive, sassy, kind of pretentious songs. Whereas here, if he wants to write simple songs like he did on Nashville Skyline and just experiment with the musical genre that meant something to him, he felt the freedom to do it. The Romantic period includes some of Dylan's all time best albums, as well as some ones that are a bit weird or forgettable. Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, I don't know whether to call it a bad album. It just has the fault of being counted as an album because it's really just one single and a bunch of, backing music for a movie. Self Portrait is an album of mostly covers that a lot of people find very frustrating. I would find it okay if it wasn't so long. Dylan was an album that Dylan didn't even commission himself. It was taken from his extra material. I actually like it a little better than Self Portrait. Anyway, but the defining songs of this era I chose are Lay Lady Lay, Day of the Locusts, Forever Young, Tangled Up in Blue, and Hurricane. So Lay Lady Lay again shows that Bob Dylan was willing to be a bit goofier and just enjoy the country music genre. Forever Young and Tangled Up in Blue showed a more raw, sentimental side. And The Locust is a bit more obscure one, but then again, the whole New Morning album is kind of obscure, but it's almost as good, if not as good, as his most famous albums. And it showed his further retreat into alienation from celebrity. Hurricane is the one song that could have fit in an earlier Bob Dylan period, but it did take place here, and it's arguably the best song he ever wrote. The next period is the Christian period. This is traditionally associated with three albums: Slow Train a Coming, Saved, and Shot of Love, as these were albums replete with Christian material, and Bob Dylan was openly practicing evangelical Christianity in this period. However, I tag on one album at the beginning, that would be Street Legal, and one album that would be the end, Infidels, because if you listen to the lyrics on them, those are clearly the on-ramp album and the off-ramp album. For the iconic songs of this era, I chose Change of the Guard, You Gotta Serve Somebody, I Believe in You, Pressing On, and Joker Man. I feel like these are fairly self-explanatory. Change of the Guard comes from the beginning of the era. It's Dylan announcing a change. You Gotta Serve Somebody is probably his most endearing song of the Christian period, and that it only has religious subtext, but it's very well-written lyrics that could appeal to people of a broad range of ideologies. I Believe in You is a very Christian song, but it's just so heartfelt that regardless of whether you love Dylan for this religious moment or feel uncomfortable with it, it's a powerful song to listen to. Pressing On is an overtly religious song, but it falls into the gospel music tradition, as in it just sounds like a form of art. It's not just someone forcing their religion on you. And Joker Man is seemingly Dylan singing about his identity and conceptions of messiahs, both messiahs he believed in and people calling him a messiah. The next set of albums is a bit more obscure, and it's what I call his blue period. I didn't really love these albums. A lot of people don't. And there's just a vague feeling of melancholy and also just kind of emptiness and loneliness. Like Dylan's lost some of the spark he had earlier. Sure, he still has a talent for writing long, well thought out lyrics, but especially on the early work in here, it feels like all he knows about how to write about anymore is like mild relationship dysfunction. So this includes the albums Empire Burlesque, Knocked Out Loaded, Down in the Groove, and Oh Mercy. And for my five songs, I chose Tight Connection to My Heart because it's just an example of Dylan trying to fit in with the 80s. Brownsville Girl, a very impressive song, though maybe not as melodic as similar songs from earlier periods. Silvio, the sort of one shining light on the Down in the Groove album. Political World, because it shows Bob Dylan kind of trying to be his older self, but now being even more cryptic than he was before and very cynical in his delivery. And finally, Most of the Time. The last album of this period, Oh Mercy, is one where I feel like most of the songs individually are quite impressive, but they all kind of blend in with each other. So I don't even know if Most of the Time is the best representative of those songs, but it's just one I remembered and you could have chosen lots. Next, we have what I call the black and white period, which includes Under the Red Sky, Good as I've Been to You, World Gone Wrong, Time Out of Mind, Love and Theft, Modern Times, and Together Through Life. I call this the black and white period, both because it continues to have the sort of somber quality of the blue period, but it seems slightly more playful, perhaps more exaggerated in its down and out feel, and that Bob Dylan has now really taken the influence from blues music. And most of these albums have a black and white photo of Bob Dylan as cover art, presumably coincidentally, but I read some meaning in it. Bob Dylan increasingly writes in the 12-bar blues format. He also sings kind of melancholy barroom jazz in here. For my representative songs, I chose Born in Time, which is a beautiful and relatively obscure song from Under the Red Sky, Mississippi, a mournful song that I interpret as Dylan writing a kind of premature swan song for his career, Lonesome Day Blues, just my favorite of the 12-bar blues songs, Working Man Blues, number two, and finally, Jolene, a relatively simple, some might say forgettable song from this period, but it's just Dylan getting the most out of his scratchy voice, pretending to be an old-timey blues man kind of song. Finally, we get to what I call the emeritus period. In a previous video, I referred to this as an extension of the black and white period, and you could sort of do that. But what I would say is what differentiates the emeritus period is that as Bob Dylan got to his 70s, he got to the point where he'd had a truly full and wonderful music career. He put out enough material in his 60s that people couldn't just say, oh, he peaked as a young man and disappeared. But now, as he got into his 70s and 80s, he finally was free to do whatever he wanted. Some of it impressive, some of it, maybe a bit more on the fun side. So he starts with an album called Christmas in the Heart. Then comes Tempest, then comes Shadows in the Night, Fallen Angels, Triplicate, and Rough and Rowdy Ways. So for my representative songs of the period, Bob Dylan's ridiculous Christmas cover, Must Be Santa, Duquesne Whistle, Lucky Old Sun, the best of his jazz covers, I Contain Multitudes, and a wonderful poetic song where Dylan kind of speaks to people's failure to describe him as an artist because he contains multitudes. And I Made Up My Mind, a sort of beautiful song from here that shows that Dylan is at least somewhat moving away from the scratchy voice sound of his black and white period. In this emeritus period, he recorded a lot of old jazz standards, and now occasionally he tries to sing in a smooth, conventionally beautiful voice and not just the rough voice that defined the black and white and somewhat the blue period. So that's kind of how I would break up the history of Bob Dylan albums. And while a lot of people would more or less uphold those categories for, the Guthrie period, kind of the peak/romantic period, kind of the Christian period, the blue period and black and white period and emeritus period are more historically obscure. People don't tend to talk about them in terms of categories. So I just thought if I'm explaining Bob Dylan to someone who has similar ambitions, wants to listen to all the albums, that's a good way to conceptualize it. So now I did make a list ranking all the Bob Dylan albums. However, the list is more meaningful towards the top. Some of these probably could have been moved around, and the rankings might depend kind of on my mood when I listen to them. So at the bottom, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, because other than the great song Knocking on Heaven's Door, kind of unlistenable. Number 37, Empire Burlesque. I just found a lot of the songs uninspiring, and while occasionally the 80s synth production worked, usually it just felt like an awkward mismatch. Number 36, Down in the Groove, has the great song Silvio and a pretty decent song in Ugliest Girl in the World, but just overall felt like Bob Dylan was having too sad a time recording it. Number 35, I put Saved, has the very good gospel song Pressing On it, but the rest was just kind of forgettable. Number 34, Self Portrait, maybe not as bad as people make it out to be, but if you listen to it as a whole album, it certainly goes on too long. Number 33, Good as I've Been to You. It has the disadvantage that it's a covers album. And while it has some great guitar playing from Bob Dylan, eventually it just kind of gets dreary and loses me. Right above it, 32, I put World Gone Wrong, a similar album, but just a bit tighter and had a few more catchy moments. Number 31, Dylan. So this is a similar album to Self Portrait. And while many would rank it lower, since Dylan did not curate this one, it was just put out by his former record company. As I said earlier, I just happen to like some of the songs on this, and it's shorter, so it's a tighter listen. Number 30, Street Legal, certainly has some catchy, well written songs, but also has some less written songs. And while I like that it brings in a loud production style, the production gets kind of repetitive and got to me a bit. Number 29, Shot of Love. Other than a song called Property of Jesus, which had a funny title, I felt this one was kind of lacking for catchy and memorable material, but there was nothing bad about it. I appreciated, if didn't love, Bob Dylan's unusual choice to write a song about the greatness of Lenny Bruce, even while Bob Dylan was supposedly in a religious conservative phase. Number 28, I put Tempest. Duquesne Whistle is a solid song, and I liked his songwriting about John Lennon on here. Nothing bad, just nothing that really stuck with me. Number 27, his jazz covers album, Shadows in the Night. I didn't love all the choices of songs on here other than Lucky Old Song and maybe another, but it's certainly cool that Bob Dylan made the Frank Sinatra covers thing work. Immediately above this, I put his third Frank Sinatra covers album of Triplicate. This one has some more fun songs on it, a greater range of jazz covers. But if one wants to listen to it as a whole album, the triple album thing definitely becomes too much. At number 25, I put Oh Mercy. As I said earlier, I think lots of the songs on here are great, but it's just too bleak overall, and a lot of the songs feel too conceptually similar. At number 24, Knocked Out Loaded. A lot of people are very harsh on this one because I think the first two tracks are really bad, but it comes more into its own, and Brownsville Girl is a real classic. Number 23, I put Time Out of Mind. This one won an Album of the Year Grammy, and people really love it. I might have just been in a very depressed place when I listened to this one. But yeah, my sense of it is very impressive lyrics, but overall, I want something to break up the bleakness. Next on the list, I put Infidels. Joker Man has a great, memorable sound to it. And a lot of the other songs on here, I had a kind of good, not great relationship to. Then I put Fallen Angels because this was the most fun of the Bob Dylan jazz cover albums. He allowed himself to lean into songs that didn't fit his grumbling man in the shadows image. Then I put Under the Red Sky. This one, I feel like people are hard on it maybe because of the first song, Wiggle, 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 a kind of awkward children's song, but the blues song, Cats in the Well, is pretty catchy. And there are just lots of interesting moments of Bob Dylan beginning to explore a grainy vintage aesthetic. Next on the list, I put Modern Times. I really love the song on here, as I said, Working Man Blues, number 2. Otherwise, like lots of stuff on the black and white period, the sound feels a bit too much like homage to the past and not necessarily truly visionary Dylan stuff, but the lyrics are great. Immediately above it, I put Love and Theft, which I had a similar relationship to. But again, I have two songs I really love on here in Mississippi and Lonesome Day Blues. And then right before that, I put another related album, Together Through Life. This one maybe doesn't have a great song in the way that Love and Theft and Modern Times do, but I feel like it's the most consistent, overall enjoyable. Have You Ever Gone to Houston is a nice little tune. I said I find Jolene really catchy. It's All Good is a good concept for a Bob Dylan song. Next on the list, I put the album called Bob Dylan, his first album of mostly covers, though it had two kind of significant originals in Talking New York Blues and a song for Woody Guthrie. I think the fact that it's mostly covers holds it back from being higher, but this is the covers album by far Bob Dylan has the most fun with. Next on the list, I put Rough and Rowdy Ways. You would have just seen my review of this one if you're a devoted watcher. I maybe don't love it musically, but it's a really impressive album lyrically, and I Contain Multitudes is such a good addition to the Dylan canon. And while it's maybe not great as a song, Murder Most Foul is certainly an important thing to listen to and quite impressive in its own way. Next on the list, I have Planet Waves. This one is maybe a bit too gritty at points for me, but Forever Young is an amazing song, and enough else on here was kind of gripping in its emotionally intense delivery. Then we get Nashville Skyline. This one was kind of underwhelming to me when I listened to it, only in that the lyrics are starting to be less ambitious than the early stuff. And it's kind of just Bob Dylan writing country music. It's not particularly quirky, unique country music, but some of these songs performed in slightly different contexts. Lay Lady Lay, Tonight Always Staying Here With You, and I threw it all away, quite compelling in their own right. Next on here, New Morning. This is probably the quintessential underrated Bob Dylan album. New Morning, the title track has such energy, as does Day of the Locusts. There's a song supposedly about meeting a fictionalized version of Elvis on here. Yeah, a lot of this album is really fun and interesting, and even the weird If Dogs Run Free. Then we get another side of Bob Dylan. As I said, I don't love listening to this one. I feel these songs don't have the pacing to work as standalone acoustic tunes, but luckily so many of them would go on to be covered by groups like the Byrds and the Turtles, and their lyrics are so great and so pivotal in the Bob Dylan story. I already mentioned It Ain't Me, Babe, but My Back Pages is another great poem about Dylan's shift in identity, trying to be political when that wasn't a good fit for him. Next on the list, I have Slow Train a Comin'. So this makes my top 10. And yes, while this is a sometimes conservative Christian album, it's undoubtedly a very enjoyable record to listen to. It ranges from very well written blues songs to emotionally intense performances. You will either enjoy it as a Bob Dylan album if you're not listening to the lyrics too closely, or you can respect your conflicted feelings if you are listening to the lyrics too closely, or you're a conservative evangelical and you just like it unequivocally. Next on the list, I put Highway 61 Revisited, because Like a Rolling Stone is such a perfect recording. And yeah, a lot of other good moments on this one as well. Desolation Row, Queen Jane Approximately. I do feel with this record, it's Dylan doing the same thing again and again, showing off his poetic style, often using similar musical backing. And you begin to tell these songs don't necessarily mean that much. They're just wordplay. So it gets to be overkill, it gets to be repetitive, but each song individually is very good, and Like a Rolling Stone is amazing. Next on here, I put The Basement Tapes. This one's a bit harder to rank because it's mixed in with some songs that are primarily songs by the band and not performed or written by Bob Dylan, but it's just a very good time to listen to. It is a double album, but it's not one you get bored of. Maybe no great songs, but You Ain't Going Nowhere is a good song. And yeah, a great mix of the styles of two legendary artists in Bob Dylan and the band. Desire has the problem that some of the albums lower on this list does, in that it has a kind of consistent melancholy feel. I feel like the album repeats the same sound too much. That said, there's so much interesting going on with this one. The slightly awkward song Joey is memorable, and the better written, conceptually similar song Hurricane is amazing as a frantic attempt to tell the whole story of a wrongful conviction. It has the poppy Mozambique. It has the stylized but equally catchy Romance in Durango, the subtle, mysterious, but clearly storytelling of Black Diamond Bay. Then we have The Times They Are Changing, a bit of a dry sound for those who don't love pure folk, but yeah, just so many interesting compositions on here, from the title track and Hattie Carroll to Restless Farewell represented here. Next, we get Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, which includes, three of the most classic songs of all time: Blowing in the Wind, Don't Think Twice, It's All Right, and Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, as well as a lot of kind of 60s humorous, improvisy kind of songs. It's pretty much a good time throughout. Number four, maybe slightly less of an underdog than New Morning, but a bigger underdog, if one considers how high it is on the list, is John Wesley Harding. After a few albums of Bob Dylan exploring a bigger sound, here he mostly strips down to his acoustic sound of earlier, but allowing bass and drums to play more of a role, and shows how impressive his talent is when he condenses his ability to come up with words to shorter, more concise songs that still contain equally cryptic and fascinating images, and also just some very beautiful melodies. As I Went Out One Morning isn't a particularly famous song, but I feel intrigued every time I hear it. Third on the list, I have Bringing It All Back Home. This album is one foot in Dylan's old door of acoustic songs and one foot in his more rock and roll, loud sounding door, and just its classic after classic. The idiosyncratically worded but still beautiful love song of Love Minus Zero, No Limits, the quasi protest song of Maggie's Farm, the haunting, mysterious It's All Right, Mom, Only Bleeding, the goodbye to his own old sound, It's All Over Now, Baby Blue, so much on there. Number two on my list, we have Blonde on Blonde. This is one of Dylan's best experiments in creating music that has a poppy, catchy sound. As I mentioned earlier, Just Like a Woman. There's also I Want You, You'll Go Your Way, and I'll Go Mine. There's my personal favorite that pained me not to include in one of my top five lists, Stuck Inside of Mobile with the Memphis Blues again, where it's Dylan coming up with fun imagery, but more blatantly than any of his other songs, making fun of and playfully laughing at the excesses of his songwriting. And then number one on my list, we have Blood on the Tracks. Every song on here sounds different, even if there's some low-key thematic cohesion. Here we have Bob Dylan applying his poetic, mysterious songwriting talent, but still seemingly singing from the heart. He denied these songs were directly autobiographical, and how I interpret that is he did not want people saying, oh, is this a reference to this person, to this event? But yeah, clearly there's something personal going on, and the delivery and the nostalgic, melancholy time hopping of Tangled Up in Blue, the playful concluding track of Buckets of Rain, and the not always loved, but I think a good time, ridiculous Western epic of Lily Rosemary and the Jack of Hearts. Bob Dylan has a lot of good songs, but as an album from start to finish, you can't beat Blood on the Tracks. It's his best album and one of the best albums of all time, period. So let me know what you think of this rankings as well as my breaking down of Bob Dylan's musical career. I had a lot of fun doing this, and thank you, Bob, for making wonderful music. I'm Zach Morgenstern. This is Ludwig von B. See you next time.